मानुषी के मित्रों को मेरा नमस्कार. Friends, in recent years, a growing number of Hindus have begun recognizing that no other group in the world has been subjected to as much violence, loot, plunder, and brutalization at the hands of foreign invaders owing allegiance to Islam and Christianity as have Hindus. As a result of this new awakening, many Hindu intellectuals have begun to describe the Islamic and British colonial onslaughts as a history of repeated Hindu genocides. However, leading Indologist Koenraad Elst, who has spent his entire life battling the distorted narratives peddled by Commie and Islamist historians, strongly disagrees with the use of the term genocide to describe the onslaughts of Islam and Christianity in India. And he offers very compelling reasons for it. Listen to his reasoning for yourself.
We're going to talk about the Hindu mass slaughter. I am right now not using any more specific term, but that there was a Hindu mass slaughter ought to be undisputed. Now, I know that in India there is a problem of denial of history, so it is disputed. Nevertheless, it's a historical reality. It started with the first Muslim naval invasion in 636, which is 4 years after the death of the Prophet. That was repelled. Then there were several more invasions over land that were all repelled. But finally, it is Mohammed bin Qasim who broke through India's defenses in 712 and conquered Sindh, the province of Sindh in present-day Pakistan, which was then characterized by a lot of slaughter and destruction of temples. Then you get the same story with a number of other conquerors like Mahmud Ghaznavi around 1000, Muhammad Ghori in 1192, Malik Kafur, Sikandar Buchi Khan, Timur, Babar, Aurangzeb, Tipu Sultan, and many others. Then even in fairly recent memory, you have the partition slaughter 1947, mostly in West Pakistan. In East Pakistan, it was a bit longer drawn out. There you got a real genocide, I dare say, in 1971, which was stopped by the intervention of the Indian Army. Then even more recently, you have the many cases of terrorism and the expulsion of the Pandits from Kashmir in 1990. And then a lot of, frequent violent riots and terror attacks and the constant petty terror that the Hindus in Pakistan and Bangladesh have to undergo. So that's very, very, very many people killed. A first discussion is about the fact how many were killed. A figure that is bandied about a lot, I've done it myself, is by Professor K.S. Lal, the historian, who estimated in 1979 that from a study of the demography in the Middle Ages, he concludes that between the year 1000 and 1525, about 80 to 100 million Hindus disappear from the demographic statistics. Now, of course, these demographic statistics for that age are necessarily vague and necessarily can't account for all the factors like famines due to disease and things like that. So this is only an estimate. And At any rate, since 1979, nothing has been added to it. You see, this has not been further studied, partly because in Indian academe, this is not deemed to be a fit object for study. And well, partly because nobody felt the need to do better. You see, once this figure was around on the authority of a real academic historian, K.S. Lal, then everybody thought, oh, now we have it. Now we can quote 80 to 100 million. Well, that was an interesting start, but, more work ought to be done on that. So at any rate, it was very large, many millions, no doubt. Like in the 20th century alone, you have a figure approaching the Jewish Holocaust, which was about 5.3 million. So here you have about 2 million in Pakistan in 1947, 2.5 million in East Pakistan, Bangladesh in 1971. That's already very close. It, of course, completely dwarfs the communal violence in India since 1947. You see, there is a story abroad that India is a very dangerous place for the minorities, and that there's a constant threat of the ugly, vicious, overbearing Hindu majority throwing the Muslims into the Indian Ocean, and so on. But in reality, all the communal violence in India combined, both from the Hindu and from the Muslim side, together, is completely dwarfed by the actual killing that happened in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. Anyway, so we know it was large, but was it genocide? That's the question I will focus on. You see, this word is thrown around much too easily. Like, for instance, I remember when at the fag end of his life, the Chilean dictator Pinochet was taken to court by a Spanish judge, Baltasar Garzón. And of course, to just bring a foreign head of state to court, that's not so easy to do. That's against all kinds of international treaties and so on. So to overrule all those limitations, the judge had to accuse Pinochet of genocide. And effectively, at some point in his career, he had killed 3 Spanish activists who had fled Chile. Killed 3 people. That can never possibly be counted as a genocide. I mean, at least reasonably. So you see there, the word genocide was used as well as a juridical trick. Also didn't lead to anything. But so on that same model, many people rhetorically use the term genocide, and often it is not entirely warranted, even if the killing is very large. And we'll see some examples. So genocide means intentionally targeting a community for destruction. And destruction does not necessarily mean killing. It can also mean preventing procreation. Like, for instance, at this moment, some American NGOs are accusing China of committing genocide on the Uyghur minority in China by sterilizing them or giving them medicine that has a sterilizing effect. Many other NGOs laugh at this, say this is American propaganda. I will not speak out on it. Nevertheless, the fact here is that genocide does not necessarily mean killing. And Conversely, of course, killing, even mass killing, does not necessarily mean genocide. Genocide must also be differentiated from ethnic cleansing. Like in Kashmir 1990, the Kashmiri Pandits were thrown out. There was some killing, of course, but that was described by the Pakistanis as killing one to expel 100. So there was some killing, enough to create a feeling of terror, of fear, so that they all left. And so they are certainly victims. They are victims of ethnic cleansing, but not exactly of genocide. You see, at no point did the Pakistanis make an intention clear of physically killing all the Kashmiri Pandits. I mean, if they had wanted to do that, they could have. And so their aim was set a little lower. More generally, Islam does not target the physical elimination of any unbeliever community. You see, it wages jihad, it ordains jihad. This is not some misunderstanding of some later followers. No, this is laid down by Muhammad himself. And the example was given by Muhammad himself, conquering, and then pressurizing or forcing the people to convert to Islam, or to at least recognize Muhammad as their overlord. In the case of Christians and Muslims, much later also extended to Hindus. You could become a dhimmi, that is to say subordinate to Muslim rule, accepting Muslim rule, accepting a number of humiliating conditions, but that way you could survive, but that's on sufferance. Like, for instance, in Muhammad's own lifetime, they exiled a Jewish community in Medina to the oasis of Khaybar. At a high price, they extorted half their income, but nevertheless, they could stay there for a while, but it was on Muslim sufferance. And so the day the Muslims said, no, you can't stay anymore, they had to leave Khaybar also. But so, you see, in those very limited conditions, killing was not strictly necessary. So Islam does not set out to kill all unbelievers. In fact, the first generation of Muslims had been unbelievers themselves, had converted to Islam. So Islam is perfectly familiar with the phenomenon that those unbelievers whom you target for war and perhaps for killing, they can convert to Islam, then they are on your side, then you don't have to kill them anymore. So mass killing occasionally happens, but that's only an instrument for this conquest. And Muhammad, by temperament, preferred people to recognize him. That was the most important goal in his life, to be gratified, to be recognized as the prophet by everyone. And so killing people was only a second option. The real goal was to have everybody accept Muhammad's claim to prophecy. So I think it's important to stress this point, that nothing is gained by exaggerations or inaccuracies. On principle, I say truth alone prevails. I haven't invented that myself. That's in the Upanishad, if I'm not mistaken. It's the Indian Republic's national motto. But there's also a strategic circumstance. If you don't care about truth, then at least care about winning. You see, you're not going to win as Hindus if you afford inaccuracies. You see, the enemy can get away with lies, and indeed, the enemy is lying all the time. There's huge anti-Hindu propaganda the world over, mostly fostered precisely by the Indian secularists. But they can get away with this. You see, the strategic situation is that you can't. Any inaccuracy you make will be magnified. There will be stories about it, how Hindus are liars, how they do fake news and, all these fancy new terms just to put you down as untrustworthy. So it is very necessary to be accurate and precise. Even then, of course, count on it that they will still try to misrepresent what you say and still try to blacken it somehow. Nevertheless, you're in a far better position to defend yourself if you have the truth on your side. So it's important to be precise about what exactly is the Hindu experience of mass slaughter. Now, let me make a comparison that Hindus themselves make all the time. It is with the Nazi Holocaust. This Holocaust, originally, it was a term for the Armenian side at the hand of the Ottoman Empire, 1915, 1918. It means a fire sacrifice. It's a biblical term. And the Armenians had been taking refuge in a city, Urfa, and the Turks surrounded that city. And instead of taking the trouble of fighting their way in, they simply burned the city down. So, there was a physical occasion when the Armenians met a death through fire. That's where the term Holocaust comes from. Anyway, in the Second World War, it was used in general for what happened to the Jews. Now, here again, I'll try to be a little bit precise because story. So there was originally no German design to exterminate the Jews. In Europa, which means final solution of the Jewish question in Europe, what they meant was expulsion of the Jews, banishing them outside Europe. There was a plan Madagascar or anything else as long as they got rid of them. And indeed, there is a memorandum from 1940 where Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the body that actually performed this extermination, still wrote, physical genocide is reprehensible. It's a Stalinist method. It's un-Germanic. We don't want to lower ourselves to this. But then in 1941, the war became far more acute with the invasion in the Soviet Union. Then they still tried to get rid of the Jews in another way, which was to banish them to some of the conquered territories, especially in Belarus. And the commanders who were there, they didn't know what to do with them. And so they themselves already started killing them. And so this made the idea of mass killing more acceptable to the leadership. And so soon as they started devising a mass plan and immediately put it into operation with actual killing on the Eastern Front as the German armies advanced, they had all these Jewish populations behind the lines. So they started killing them simply by neck shots. But then they found out, this is a big strain on the men who do the killing. So they devised something more impersonal, which was gassing. This was done in a number of camps in Poland to get rid of Polish Jewry, more than 3 million people. So this was executed in 1942. And then there is Auschwitz, that's the best known camp. That was originally not a place for extermination. That was a labor camp. And in fact, the SS was setting up some kind of a state within the state inside Nazi Germany, with Auschwitz more or less as their capital. Now, I think that even for SS men, it is a bit morbid to devise a killing site, to plan that as your own capital, as the place you look up to where you put your headquarters and so on. So originally it was not like that, it was an industrial center. And but later, of course, it was transformed into a killing center, and it became the biggest of them all. Okay, so 5.3 million, that's not the biggest mass killing in history. Indeed, we will see in India that we have a far larger number, but it certainly was the most intense. You see, there is a reason why the Holocaust counts as the epitome of mass killing. You see, there was no escape. Every Jew was a potential target, including children. And indeed, Heinrich Himmler said explicitly, if we take responsibility, we should not leave the responsibility for killing the next generation to our own next generation. You see, we should relieve them of this burden by killing them all. And so any escape route that the Jews tried, the Nazis made clear that it would not work. Like some Jews converted to Christianity, hoping they would then count as Christians and not as Jews. But you see, the Nazi view was that Jews are a race. Whatever religious color they take on, their genes are still the same. And it's those that we have to eliminate. So it became the genocide par excellence. Now, genocide is not a new phenomenon. In the Bible, you find a few examples. When Moses and his lieutenant Joshua entered the promised land, well, Moses didn't enter it, he died in the sight of the promised land just before entering it. But so Joshua entered and conquered the promised land and killed all the original inhabitants. At least that's what the Bible says. Whether it is historical, that is disputed, but it is the story that Bible thumpers believe in. And it's ordained by God himself. Like, for instance, there is a phase where the Philistines are being killed by the Israelite king Saul. And so he has the command from God to kill them all. And then when he falls short of executing them, this command, and leaves a number of them alive, he's reprimanded by God and he's deposed as king. All right, so this idea of genocide was taken quite seriously. Then you have a biblical case of ethnocide. The Assyrians conquer half of Israel, the northern half, where 10 of the 12 tribes live, and they deport them, they take them away, and they spread them among the Assyrian population in what is now Kurdistan, northern Iraq, eastern Turkey. And effectively, geneticists say that today you can see that the Kurdish population is genetically the most akin to the Israelite population. So there is some truth to this. You know, the 10 tribes were deported. They were not taken to Manipur, as some people in Manipur are now saying. They were not taken to America, as the Mormons are saying. No, but they went there to northern Iraq, eastern Turkey, eastern Syria, and there they somehow assimilated into the existing population. So their identity was destroyed. That's what you call ethnocide, but they were not physically killed. Usually a genocide happens as a culmination of an armed aggression after encountering resistance. You see, if you can just fight them and defeat them, there may be some leniency. But if they really put up a fight, really put up a defense, then the aggressor gets angry and wants to punish them completely. Um, like this is the case in my own country, Belgium, where Caesar exterminated several Celtic and Germanic tribes after they had committed rebellion. But otherwise, if they behaved nicely, then he didn't do any such thing. Genghis Khan in Mongolia killed entire cities like Khwarezm in I think Turkmenistan, or Baghdad was completely exterminated by Hülegu, the grandson of Genghis Khan, killing about 1.2 million. Then you have and that's very pertinent here, you have the case of Muhammad. You see there the figures are much lower, but nevertheless, one tribe in the city of Medina opposed him, namely the Banu Qurayza, a Jewish tribe. So he killed all the men. You know, figures are between 600 and 900. And then he enslaved the women and children. The most attractive woman he put into his own harem. But so it's only half genocide in the sense that he allows the non-combatants to live, even if enslaved and so on, but still he didn't die them all. In the Bible, you have some cases where indeed they only kill the combatants. That's outside the promised land, but inside the promised land, they have to kill everyone, men, woman, child, and even the cattle. So Muhammad didn't go that far, but it could reasonably be termed a form of genocide. At any rate, it was entirely intentional. Often a genocide, to explain its intensity, is justified as defensive. Like you had a clear case only like 25 years ago in Rwanda, where the Hutus had fled to a neighboring country. No, the Hutus were inside the country. The Tutsis had fled to the neighboring country of Uganda, and then were starting to reconquer Rwanda. So for the Hutus, there was a psychology that said, okay, either we're going to completely be run over by the Tutsis or we eliminate them. And so this particular genocide was justified as necessary for self-defense. Then you have the case of mass famines. And in India, there have been a number such. The most criminal case is the Holodomor in Ukraine in 1932-33. That was Joseph Stalin's intentional mass killing of millions. How many millions is still a matter of dispute. Walter Duranty of the New York Times, who denied the massacre even when it was happening, and even when he had been a witness to it. But nevertheless, privately, he spoke of 10 million killed. Now, of course, this is difficult to estimate. So some people say, no, it's only as low as 2 million. Others say 8 million or so. It's somewhere that size. And indeed, it's a rather unfunny joke in quizzes and so on in Europe, when you say, okay, you know, what was the biggest genocide in 20th century Europe? Hint, it starts with holo, either Holocaust or Holodomor. Anyway, it was a big thing and it was intentional. So it qualifies for the term genocide. It was also, in a way, it was also worse than the Holocaust because it happened entirely in peacetime. You see, if there hadn't been the Second World War, it's not sure that the Holocaust would have happened, because then Hitler would have made a deal with the British, the Americans or so, to just ship off all the Jews. And so, of course, it's not pleasant to be banished, to be exiled. But as the Jews know very well from their own history, it is preferable to being killed. Um, Whereas you see in the case of what Stalin did, well, he had no military necessity of doing this. This was just part of his policy, you see, to have this collectivization. There was a certain resistance against it from the richer farmers in Ukraine, which is a very fertile, opulent land. So to push through his policy, he committed genocide. The biggest mass famine was in the Great Leap Forward. This was a policy by Chairman Mao in China, 1959-62, where there was a forced collectivization and a forced industrialization of the countryside. This meant that farmers had to start working, starting producing steel and so on, and neglecting agriculture. And so this led to a lot of disorganization of the countryside. And this was not at all conscious policy. Mao didn't want to kill the farmers. He didn't want to kill the Chinese people. He had, in fact, no killing in mind. Only he had a very strange, unworkable economic policy. And as a result of the communist system, the lower level administrations were afraid to tell the truth to the central leadership. So initially, he didn't know that his policy was faltering massively. Because under communism, everybody felt compelled to lie. And so they kept it from the central leadership how bad this policy was working out. So ultimately, it ran up to tens of millions of victims. One figure I've seen is 46 million. Some say as low as 20 million. At any rate, the biggest mass famine in history. And yet, for the sake of precision, I have to add, it was not genocide. It was the biggest mass death, mass famine. Nevertheless, it was not genocide. He didn't intend to kill the Chinese people. He didn't intend to kill the farmer class. Similarly, in Cambodia, 1975 to 79, you had the killing fields by the Khmer Rouge. And so there too, it's a bit more ambiguous. Of course, Pol Pot intended a mass killing, but not of the whole Cambodian people. Not as many as there, effectively about 1/3 of the people was killed. So it went much farther than what he originally intended. He intended to kill the bourgeois, the urban bourgeoisie, those who spoke a foreign language, those who wore glasses, and so on, all the signs of being a bourgeois, that was good enough to get people killed. But so to call it a genocide, yeah, that's more of a genocide, but not as much as the figures would say. This is a big problem for historians. When can you call something a genocide? When the Spanish entered South America, and all the way up to California, up to North America, they killed an enormous amount of Native Americans. Estimates are like 80 million, at any rate, millions. Yet, the part that was done by killing was in fact very limited. You see, they brought with them diseases, and these diseases did all the killing. Then there are a few episodes where they see this working of the diseases. So there are a few cases, a few incidents where, for instance, they hand out blankets as a sort of gift, as a goodwill sign knowing very well that these blankets have been used by some diseased person, and that this way, the disease will spread. So there are a few such cases, let's say biological warfare, but they're in a minority. As for biological warfare, this started to the extent that we know with the Mongols um, besieging a city, a trade colony of the Venetians, or was it the Genovans? Anyway, some Italians in what is now Russia on the Black Sea. And so to besiege the city, they used to throw fire into it and so on, hoping that it would work, some disaster. And so when the plague rages in their own ranks, they take corpses of people who have the plague in them and catapult those into the city. And then some people fleeing the city, some Italians, take the disease with them. And that way the plague comes into Italy and spreads in Europe and kills about 1/3 of the European population, right? But so again, that's a genocidal proportion. Nevertheless, that's not really genocide. It's not that anybody was there to kill 1/3 of the European population or 2/3 of the Native American population. So strictly speaking, I'd be careful with calling that genocide. As for Indian famines, there have been quite a few, many more than the Bengal famine of 1943. There have been natural famines all through history and everywhere. But so in India specifically, in the time of the Sultanate, you get punitive land taxes, which again have the effect of impoverishing the peasantry, of jeopardizing the agricultural system. So there you have already a number of famines. Then in the British period, you get more of them. And so in the case of the Bengal famine, the one most talked of, that killed 3-4 million people. And it was, of course, not Winston Churchill's intention to kill Indians. It's just that he didn't care. And so his economic policies, when they proved to have a devastating effect on the Bengal population, well, he didn't care enough to do anything about it. He could have done something like importing grain from Australia. And well, no, you see, he had a very negative opinion of the Indian people. And so, sometimes he was in a Christian mood, like for instance, there were plans after the war to impoverish Germany, to inflict famines on Germany, but the war was already over. And so he said, it's unchristian to do that. Whatever, whether that's theologically correct or not, is not my point here. He simply opposed such a policy. He thought it was inhumane and so on. Well, in the case of India, he didn't have that reflex, because he very well attestedly had a contempt for the Indian people, a beastly people with a beastly religion, according to him. But so there's no intention to eliminate them. After all, they were his lucrative laborers. So strictly speaking, if I may be so harsh as to try to be precise, it's collateral damage. Like all the 46 million dead in the Great Leap Forward, that was collateral damage. Yeah, but so nevertheless, he voluntarily took decisions that led to the famine, and he very deliberately refrained from decisions that could have diminished or relieved the famine. Okay, now the Hindu case of mass slaughter. That was certainly over 1,000 years and over an entire subcontinent, much larger than the Holocaust. So even in the 20th century, it comes to about 5 million people. Over 13 centuries, it certainly comes to tens of millions of people. Now, how many? Again, you see, that's a big search. If Indian historians had started working on this since 1947, then by now we could have given far more reliable figures. But that has not been done, and very deliberately so. So I do not have the answer. I know it's very many. I know it's tens of millions, but how many? Well, that remains to be researched. It's mostly in wartime. In peacetime, escape was perfectly possible. You could get a far better deal by converting. And this not only in matters of life and death. Matter of life and death is, for example, the execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur. You see, he was sought for some common crime. It's not true that he went to court to challenge the authority of Aurangzeb and demand freedom of religion or so. No, he was arrested. In fact, he tried to escape arrest, but he was arrested, brought to court, and then the Mughal regime gave him the option. You can convert and thereby escape the death penalty. And this was very common in court cases. If you had a court case with your neighbor about something, something from ordinary life, you could win your trial automatically by converting. So this option of conversion is not a fair thing. Is of course a bit of a crime in itself. Nevertheless, it's different from automatic mass killing. In wartime, of course, there you have cases of genocide where the Muslims simply say, okay, kill them all. Like, for instance, when Timur had conquered Delhi, he specifically directed his soldiers to go and plunder the Hindu neighborhoods and spare the Muslim ones. Then, when he was militarily a bit with his back against the wall, all his men had captured about 100,000 Hindus. So at that point, they were a danger. If they had risen in revolt, it would have been troublesome. So I said, okay, get rid of them, kill them all. So there are such cases of genocidal violence, but on the whole, it is not genocide. You also have the case of mass enslavement. You of course know about African slavery, both across the Atlantic and to the Muslim world. There's millions of Europeans were enslaved by the Muslims. And so what fewer people know about is the Indian enslavement of Hindus by Muslims. And so many Hindus were exported to Central Asia. In fact, that's where the name Hindu Kush comes from. So the mountains forming the border between Afghanistan and India, they were called Hindu Ko, which in Persian means Indian mountain. But then when the slaves on transport to Central Asia from India died there en masse, then somebody got the idea of renaming this as Hindu Kush, the slaughter of the Hindus. Right, so you have this mass enslavement, which is not a good condition for procreation. Nevertheless, it is also known from Muslim writings that they had a great liking for Hindu women. And so Hindu women were often used as, let's say, as cattle for procreating, so to speak. So in the populations of Uzbekistan, Iran, and so on, if geneticists go looking for it, you will find quite an Indian element. Just like in Turkey, for instance, populations come from about Mongolia. That's where the real Turks come from. But if you see the Turks today, they are practically white because generation after generation after generation, the upper classes went to the slave market and bought Slavic, Russian, Serbian, and so on slave women and took them into their harems. And so you see, this way, Hindus have survived not as Hindus, but at least as human beings. They have left a certain genetic imprint on the Central Asian population. Then there is, of course, mass cultural destruction. I hardly need to explicitate that. Okay, so which term are we going to use for this mass slaughter of Hindus? When Francois Gautier opened up his museum, which is now called the Shivaji Museum in Pune, which is precisely about all these injustices to the Hindus, some people were lobbying with him to call it the Holocaust Museum, Hindu Holocaust Museum. He wasn't in favor. I implored him, don't make that mistake. That's a huge mistake. I mean, you have a very good case. It's very important to make it known to the world and so on. But if you do this, you blow your own case. You see, first of all, the term Holocaust has already been taken. And nowadays it is identified with what happened to the Jews in the Second World War. And so if you try to snatch that away from them and appropriate it to yourself, they're just not going to like it. And I see that on internet lists, like, you know, those of professional lists of the Indologists and so on, where somebody has heard, oh yes, some Hindu says Hindu Holocaust, oh that's you know, that's cultural appropriation, so to speak, and so they don't like it, and the Jews themselves will like it even less. And it is very, I mean, the Jews are your allies, you know, whatever your theological differences and so on. In the modern world as it is, you have a lot in common. And so it is totally silly to jeopardize that alliance. It is also unimaginative. It is bad diplomacy. And from a Hindu strategic angle, there is something even worse, perhaps. It doesn't draw attention to the specificity of the Hindu experience. Because now you are talking about what happened to Hindus, and yet you are drawing attention to what happened to the Jews by using this term. So, you know, if you want to reach your justified quantum of attention, then you should tell your own story. And so you better summarize it into one specific word that means specifically the massacre of Hindus. Now, there is at the moment no such term. There are a few organizations like the Hindu Jagaran Samiti that already are using such a word in Hindi, at least. So there are several possibilities, like Sangharana or Jana Sangharana, to mean that it is not just a massacre of someone specific, but a massacre of a whole people. Hindu Jana Sangharana, Hindu Vansha Sangharana, Hindu Vansha Vichedana, extermination or elimination. So far, I have simply used the very general, very non-committal, imprecise term Hatya, Like, for instance, in the Buddha's life, when his tribe, the Shakyas, are targeted for massacre by Prince Virudaka, this episode is called the Shakya Hatya. Or if a cow is being killed, it's called Go Hatya, and so on. So I use that term, but it's only provisional. It's just because this Hatya doesn't say anything about is it a willful. Um, I mean, if you go with your car in the countryside and you overrun a cow and the cow is dead, and the people around it care about this cow, they will accuse you of Go Hatya. And still, it wasn't intentional. You had no intention of killing the cow. Still, they will call it Go Hatya. Well, okay. So Hatya has a large meaning. So provisionally, I use that term, Hindu Hatya. But in fact, I understand something more precise should be devised here and then should be popularized. It should become a very well-known term, somewhat like Holocaust. Now, I leave it up to Hindus to do this. A few bright Hindus have to put their brains together and decide on this. Now, there is also the problem of the denial of this massacre. So in French, it is called négationnisme if you deny the Holocaust. Negationism, so in English, negationism. So at the moment in Europe, this is a movement that's mostly a thing of the past. There are very few nowadays who still bother to deny the Holocaust, mainly because of a biological fact. The generation that had some living memory of World War II is gone. And the next generation doesn't care as much anymore. That doesn't mean it's gone. You see, it's still massively present, but in the Muslim world. And there, you see, the creative phase of negationism has gone. You see, the generation of negationists in the 80s, 90s, they would go to these places, you see, do research there, find out in Auschwitz whether the buildings show traces of this gas that was used, and so on. And so there you had people who really were confident that they could scientifically prove that there had never been a Holocaust. That stage is over. The last sign of life of this was in 2005, I think, 5 or 6, when there was in Tehran, 2005, in Tehran, a conference organized by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, where he brought together the most important Holocaust deniers from Europe with a number of people from the Muslim world, where, the Holocaust denial was praised and was sanctified and was certainly given more legitimacy in the Muslim world. So now the situation is that most Muslims are more or less explicitly Holocaust deniers. In schools in Europe, nowadays history teachers face the problem that when they want to talk about the Holocaust, they are strongly opposed by a number of their pupils. And often they dare not teach about it anymore. Now, what tricks did they use? You see, one thing is that they achieved some small successes, and they clutched at the straw of these small successes. For instance, there's the case of Jesse Owens. He was a black athlete, took part in the Berlin Olympics in 1936, and he did not shake hands with Adolf Hitler. Now, the historical reason is that the Olympic Committee had informed Hitler, who had first shaken hands with a few of the athletes, that this is not according to the protocol. So he did not do that anymore. And so by the time Jesse Owens won the gold medal, there was no opportunity anymore for shaking hands with the Führer. But you see, the story had gained ground that Hitler had refused to shake hands with him because he was black. In fact, the true story is that being in Germany was a good time for Jesse Owens, because at that time in the American South, there was still massive discrimination against blacks. And so for the time of the Olympics in Germany, Hitler had instructed everyone, okay, let's give a good welcome to everyone. Let's, brush up our image. And so, he had a relatively good time in Germany. Now, okay, you see there, the negation is, recently this has also been admitted by official historians and so on. And the negationists immediately said, look, we've been saying this all the time. Now, that's true. Nevertheless, that has no consequence at all for the question whether the Holocaust happened. So, there are some small successes that, you have to admit are true, but nevertheless, they are unimportant, inconsequential. Then you have the case of, certain abuse of the Holocaust memory. You have a few people who have faked memoirs of the Holocaust, who have written books telling their own story about how I am a Holocaust survivor and so on. These stories turned out to be fake. Like Benjamin Wilkomirski, who was a Swiss music teacher, I think, who had never been in the German camps or so. Monique de Waal, she's from Brussels. She had a big trauma about the war because her father was a resistance fighter who was captured by the Germans and who had then, under torture, betrayed all his comrades. And so after the war, she was always spat at in school and so on, the daughter of the traitor and so on. And so apparently she compensated for that in this way. But so again, you see, this makes no difference at all to whether there was a Holocaust or not. Then you have the fact of presenting an exception as the rule or the rule as an exception. Like, for instance, the fact that there are survivors of the Holocaust. There they say, the fact that he survives proves that the Holocaust cannot have been that serious. Otherwise, they would have killed him. Well, yeah. And then, of course, you have the conspiracy theory. Oh, you see, the Zionist world conspiracy. They are in a position to spread all this propaganda, with the Jewish power in the media and so on. They just feed you all this propaganda. Well, yeah. Now, so on a very, very slender basis, they establish a belief that is mostly genuine, that is mostly heartfelt. I've been at a lecture about this where the professor said, the Holocaust denial is pure mendaciousness. Now, that is not true. You see, if you deny the Holocaust, you marginalize yourself. You won't be able to get a job and so on. People only do that because they really, really, really believe in it. You see, sometimes maybe some people with a psychological problem seek martyrdom, but mostly it's people who think they're very brave. You see, truth is on trial and I have to stand up for truth. And so people don't tell these stories just because they feel like it. In a few cases, yes, there is a factor of anti-Semitism. Is that often goes together, but not always, because there have been Jewish Holocaust deniers. And so from two angles, a few, whiz kids with a lot of science on their minds and so on, they found out quite correctly that what you get to see in Auschwitz is not what was really there. You see, Auschwitz has been under Soviet domination for half a century. And so, you see, things have been manipulated to make a more of an impression on tourists and so on. And so there was this David Cole from California who went to interview him and who showed up, you see, all the holes in the official story. Well, okay, you see, maybe the official story needs to be improved, needs to be brushed up, but again, you see, that's not good enough to deny what really happened there. Also, of course, there's not just Auschwitz. There are these Polish camps that ultimately killed more people. They did their job completely, and then they were dismantled by the Germans themselves. So there you see the evidence has practically been destroyed. Then there are the killings on the Eastern Front, killing also 500,000 or so, simply with neck shots. And well documented. Then there are SS documents that describe the state of the killing, that when they had killed 2 million people, there's this Koenraad report that describes it. And so, against the case that the negationists have tried to make, there is enough counter evidence. And because of the problem of negationism, historians have, of course, mobilized to gather more evidence. So the case is very strong, which also explains that some negationists who genuinely, honestly thought that they were onto something have finally given up and have admitted, well, yeah, maybe there is enough evidence for the Holocaust. Holocaust denial has been forbidden by law in Germany, in France, in Belgium, perhaps in more countries. In England, under Tony Blair, there has been an attempt to also outlaw Holocaust denial, but it is the Jewish community itself that blocked this. They said, you see, we came to England over the centuries as a haven of freedom and so on. We don't want to be the ones who now turn the clock back and impose thought crime. And that, I think, is the correct position. You see, if you see what this law has done in Germany, France, and Belgium, it has, first of all, given the negationists themselves an extra argument. They're hiding something from us. You see, that made them make all these comparisons with the Soviet Union. Like some Canadian negationist paper was called Samizdat, which was an underground paper in the Soviet Union. Then it has set the pattern for what is now happening on a far larger scale, the cancel culture. You see, now forbidden opinions are not just about the Holocaust, they are about race, about gender, and so on. And so more and more people are getting canceled, books are banned, statues are torn down, and so on. And so the laws against negationism have pioneered that tendency. So I'm not at all in favor of that. I'm very much against negationism, but I don't like these policies of prohibiting negationism. You see, a wrong opinion should be fought with better opinion, And so this is very relevant to the Indian situation. Every time some Muslim or some secularist insults Hindus, then there is immediately a clamor by Hindus on Twitter, we have to ban him. That's not the right approach. At least it's not mine. Now in India, there is of course also a denial of the massacres that happened here. It is not a crime at all. Indeed, it is official policy, or it has been for like half a century. to whitewash the story of Islam in India. And so in Europe, you marginalize yourself by negationism. In India, by contrast, it's a good career move. Many young historians have made their career, have launched their career precisely by attacking Hindus, by creating suspicions against all Hindu attempts to correct the history writing. Nevertheless, similar disinformation techniques are used. Like, for instance, I gave the example of exceptions are turned into the rule, rules are turned into exceptions. Not even to speak of history, even if you read today's newspapers. When there is a case like, for instance, a Muslim who does some practical job for a Hindu temple, then this is front page news. Yeah? And so they say, no, no, it's not true that Islam is fanatical, that Islam is anti-Hindu. Look at this case. Well, 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 well. I mean, that's mostly a case of the many Hindus throughout history who have converted to Islam only formally, only to be on the safe side, only to escape something that was imposed on the Hindus, but who otherwise internally remained Hindu. And so now, of course, that's ever more rare. That's why it's perhaps ever more newsworthy. It's ever more rare because now, unlike in the past, unlike even 50 years ago, Muslims are systematically brainwashed. All the Muslim children are sent to madrasas, are trained in this, indoctrinated in this fierce ideological Islamic view of Hindus. But so, I mean, once in a while, you see, when you find something nice to say about Muslims, that is played up enormously. So that way, I mean, to tell a lie is something that sometimes the liar might find necessary, but it's best avoided. You see, if you want to spread a false story, it's best to do it with as much truth as possible. Because if you tell a lie, you can be found out. And even if you have all the media on your side, it's still unpleasant. And who knows whether this media power is going to remain. So even if you're not negatively publicized now, it may still happen sometime in the future. So it's better to be, strictly speaking, truthful. And so the best is that you just play up what is good, you downplay or simply hide what is not to your like. Like, again, you see in the reporting about communal violence, if a Muslim gets killed, it's front page news. If a whole family of Hindus is killed, maybe in the Hindi press on page 17. So, you know, that has been applied very systematically in history books quite official, used in the schools ever since about 1970. It is it's a policy that was already started somewhat under Maulana Azad, who was India's first education minister. But it really became a policy all over around 1970. This had to do with Indira Gandhi's power struggle within Congress. A big faction of Congress opposed her, and so she needed allies. And she found these among the communists. And so, to make a long story short, the deal was that, okay, you see, to dole out official jobs, you know, perks of office and so on, that would be left to Indira and her son Sanjay. But the cultural power, that would be with the communists. And so they started dominating the world of education. Two names that have to be mentioned here are P. N. Haksar, her secretary, and Education Minister Nurul Hassan. And so from then on, you get the eminent historians, as they were called during the Ayodhya affair, the eminent historians, starting probably with R.S. Sharma. And then you get names like Romila Thapar, like come on, give some names. Um,
Ja,
yeah, of
Mukhia,
course, Stephen
Khan
Jha,
Habib.
the son of the president who wrote about the Upanishads. What's his name?
Rather, Gopal, S. Gopal.
Yeah, S. Gopal, Sarvepalli Gopal. Um, some more like that. Habib, Irfan Habib. So they started massively whitewashing Islamic history and setting the tone in all the history books, and indirectly also in what Bollywood produced of historical movies and so on, that were all streamlined in the secularist direction, where Hindus enthusiastically welcome Akbar and so on. Where, and even in modern movies, movies about crime or, psychological movies and so on, the pattern is always the same. The bad guys are always Hindus, and the good guys are, well, non-Hindus. And if the hero, even if he's a Hindu, if he's in trouble and he walks past the church, then he will do the rounds of the church and so on, and suddenly he'll get a great idea and get himself out of trouble. Whereas the temple is the place where the criminal conspiracies are hatched and so on. So you see, you extend that approach to the past centuries and the way the story is told about them. That's the practice of negationism in India. The picture has not very much changed under the Narendra Modi rule. There was an attempt under the Vajpayee government by Murli Manohar Joshi,
Yeah.
that unfortunately was a bit clumsy. I've seen some of the textbooks that he had written. There was one very good one, and this was about the most crucial period, the start of Muslim rule by Meenakshi Jain, which is why in foreign conferences of Indologists and so on about the history rewriting by political Hindus, she was always the target of attacks, because they knew, you see, all the rest are, they made fools of themselves. She's dangerous. But so on the whole, you see, this effort was not so successful. Anyway, it doesn't matter, whatever I think of it, because in 2004, when Congress came to power, this was all thrown out. And so the old history books were restored, even rewritten. And I have to say, objectively, impartisanly, I have to admit that sometimes these books were good, not contents-wise, but they were a great improvement as textbooks, well illustrated and, more appealing. And so nobody really had his heart in rewriting the textbooks again once Modi came to power. First of all, they had a hangover from their own failure with the Murli Manohar Joshi textbooks. And then, what I think is the most serious problem is that there was too much secularism within the BJP by that time. And so you get a situation where Minister Javadekar in 2018 actually boasted of not having changed anything in the textbooks as he had found them in 2014, as the Congress Communist Combine had made them. So, he thought, oh, look, I'm a proud secularist. I'm more secularist than you. That's essentially what he was saying. So a real policy of redoing, reshaping the history education, I don't see much of that. There are locally some initiatives. There are, of course, BJP-ruled states, sometimes already quite long, like Madhya Pradesh, where there has been some positive influence on history education. But still, I mean, for what foreigners believe about the BJP, that it's a fanatical Hindu party and so on, I don't see any results. So one more thing about the psychology behind this negationism. So they have a few standard phrases that Hindus who haven't really studied the subject might get convinced by. Like they say, oh yeah, you see, in these crimes of temple destruction and so on, there was no religion involved. It was only politics. It was set an example, to express their power, to destroy the power of the enemy. And anyway, it was the Middle Ages. Well, you see, the Middle Ages, that's not really an argument. Um, in Arabia, even before the Middle Ages, it was a multicultural society. Then Islam came and forcibly turned it into a monolithic Islamic society. And so, you see, when the Christianity conquered the Roman Empire, it was a very multicultural society, even long ago. And then they imposed the Middle Ages. So it is Christianity and Islam who made the Middle Ages into what they were. Hindus in the Middle Ages did not have the same approach. Although that's what I say, but another argument is, oh, but Hindu kings acted just the same. You see, again, that's not true. There are a few examples. This is a good example of how they clutch at straws and use one exception in order to pretend that it's the rule. There are a few cases where Hindu kings did violate the main temple in the capital of his opponent, namely by stealing, by abducting the main murti from there.
That's different from destroying the
That is,
temple.
of course, that is, of course, different.
Yeah, because you take it as something
Of course.
very precious, valuable, and you can install it in your own
Well,
mandir.
you see, secularism is another name for extreme superficiality. You see, what
No,
they see
lies,
is
not superficiality,
materially,
outright lies.
materially the same thing happens. In fact, it's not really true that the same thing happens. The temple does not get destroyed. The murti does not get destroyed. It does not get masoned into the lavatory floors, as was
Yeah.
the case under Mahmud Ghaznavi. No, you see, if I take the Shiva statue in that temple and I take it home and I put it into my own temple, well, the Shiva cult continues. Shiva worship took place there, now it takes place here for the Murti. And as for his temple, he is perfectly free to consecrate a new Shiva Murti, put it there, and the worship continues. So, these few Hindu incidents never touch the religion concern. It's only, you
No, but
see,
there's no Hindu king who also destroyed any mosque or any church, not a single example.
exactly, exactly. So, so it's not the same thing at all. But if you are as superficial as secularists are and as ignorant about all matters religion, then you might, swallow this. Then another argument, recently used by Audrey Truschke is that, yes, okay, I admit Aurangzeb destroyed a few temples. Actually, a few tens of thousands, but okay, let's say a few temples. But he also protected many temples. You see, that's a really good argument. You know, if I were a trial lawyer, I'd take inspiration from this. You see, I would say, okay, Your Honor, the facts have been proven. Yes, my client has murdered this man, but he is not a danger to society. Look, all these people he did not murder, he protected them. Yeah, 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 right. That's a way of putting it. Or, of course, it is an argument that is very often used by secularists, but there wouldn't be that many Hindus if Muslims really had been after them. You know, that's again an argument that's used, against Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. Oh, but if there really was a Holocaust, you wouldn't be here. Yeah. Now, okay, you see, this is the fun part, but now the problematic part is that, in fact, Hindus help the negationists by not countering their case properly. So one thing is the amateurishly imprecise terminology. And so this is why I insist on properly using the term genocide and avoiding its use when it's not appropriate. The vague data, like I mentioned, it's already 42 years ago that Professor K.S. Lal came up with his estimate of 80 to 100 million victims. And so nothing has been done, to make that figure more precise, to verify that. Nothing has been done to falsify it either. The opposite side has also not researched these data to disprove them. But again, there is a power equation. They can get away with it. You can't. Hindus are still in the dock, are on the defensive, so they have to do a lot better. And so then there is also no policy. You see, here and there you find individuals who try to do better. Like there is this Twitter fellow called True Indology or Bharadwaj. I don't know his true full name, but he's extremely good in setting the record straight on points of detail. You see, if you say, oh, Tipu Sultan was a good guy because he fought against the British, then he can say, oh, no, this is why he fought the British. And nevertheless, this is what he did in Mysore, in Kerala, and so on. And it just sets the record straight. And so many of these common myths, launched by the secularists are being deconstructed this way. So there are individuals who do very good work. Or Meenakshi Jain's book on the way that Hindus try to protect or restore the murtis that were targeted for destruction. You get to know a whole lot of the actual practice of how this was done, this destruction of temples and murtis, and what people invented of stratagems to somehow save what could be saved. So that is being done, but that has no official status. You see, you can convince 100 people with this book. You can convince, if you're very popular, maybe 10,000 people with your tweets on Twitter. But meanwhile, hundreds of millions are still learning through these secularist negationist textbooks. So you see, there really is an important role to play for the government that is irreplaceable. I mean, some of these Modi bhakts are saying, oh, what do? You can't, put the whole burden on the government, I mean, really, there are certain things, there is a division of labor, there are certain things that only a government can do. Why did you have to come to power if government is that unimportant? No, you see, fate has somehow brought you to power precisely because here you can do a number of things that you cannot do otherwise. Here you can realize a big part of your program that otherwise would remain in the hands of the enemy that would prevent this. So you see, there I can only call on the government and everybody who has any influence on them to finally get serious about this part of the Hindu program. Finally, there is one concern that is always cited by the negationists that I want to address. They say, yeah, you know, but we have to be a little untruthful about history. We have to whitewash certain unpleasant episodes, not because of Islamic propaganda or whatever, but simply for the sake of harmony. You see, if all these bitter memories are being revived,
But there's no harmony. If there was harmony, I think we'd be happy to forget.
yeah,
I mean, they're on the offensive and blasting and bombing and slaughtering and
I know that the picture is not as rosy as they painted. Anyway, that's the case they make. That, you know, if you tell the truth about Aurangzeb and Ghaznavi and so on, this will give a lot of resentment among Hindus against Muslims, or in Muslims it might revive ideas of, oh, we have to be tough on the Hindus.
but that they already have.
For the sake of harmony in today's society, we have to tell a few falsehoods about the past. Now, here I can only say, well, there is no revenge involved. No revenge is intended. And indeed, you see those few people who have seriously written about the restatement of proper history, they have never expressed this desire for revenge. You know, you could see it the way that, for example, Black South Africans saw the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You know, that's in fact what it is. You see, if you state the truth of what has gone wrong, then you will make a reconciliation possible. So it is very important, it is very useful for social harmony today to set the record about the past straight. Thank you.